Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk more about what we call the Spanish American War and the Filipino American War. Now, I made a video on this channel a little over a month ago on the Filipino American War, which is a war we really don't talk about much, to be perfectly honest. It's a pity, we should. And the Spanish American War, which was hardly a war at all, is also a very problematic one because there's a lot of inaccuracies about what truly happened. Now, one of the things I want to mention here, of course, first off, with the Filipino American War, which went on basically from late 1898 to 1902, July 4th, 1902, it ended. However, there were guerrilla actions going on until well into the teens, close to the beginnings of World War I. And there were an awful lot of atrocities created by the United States against the Filipinos. And we don't talk about this much. We should. You ever notice how the United States is very quick to condemn the actions of other countries that do bad things to other people, that create concentration camps, that do, in a sense, ethnic cleansing, that basically profiteer from racism and everything else? We did all of that. We just don't like to admit it. So during the Filipino and American conflict, we had concentration camps there. We had mass executions. It was a Holocaust in many respects, what we did to them. And you know something? The numbers, nobody knows. We say 250,000 Filipino civilians were killed. That's our guess. If you talk to people in the Philippines, it's often a very, very different story. They believe it's much, much higher. And you know something? I'm more inclined to believe them than I am to what the United States would say, because we did a massive whitewash of everything that was done there. Now, we had a colonial governor there for a while. His name was William Howard Taft. He was 350 pounds of colonial governor. He was appointed by William McKinley. And, well, he wasn't used to that tropical climb, and 350 pounds of colonial governor does not handle heat well. It took him a while, but he finally got used to it and came to love the area. And it's an interesting little funny thing, actually, that once he started feeling a little better, he sent a telegraph message to the Secretary of State, John Hay, and said, feeling much better, rode a horse for 20 miles today. Without missing a beat, John Hay wrote back and said, "How's the horse?" So he was there for a while and then he left. But the atrocities continued. And it wasn't just in the Philippines that these things were going on. It was in the other possessions that we were taking over. And we have a habit in our history of changing things around, sort of like how Thomas Jefferson wrote a great deal of his own history. He just erased what he had written previously and wrote stuff in later years, what he had done to make himself look better. We did the same thing in our history. And perhaps one of the more fascinating things is Cuba. We wanted Cuba. The United States had its eyes on Cuba for many, many years. And we were trying to find ways of acquiring it from Spain. Spain was not interested in selling it to us. So, of course, we sent in a second-rate piece of garbage battleship called the Maine. And I don't think it was deliberate, but it certainly was convenient that the ship blew up in Havana Harbor. Now, the interesting thing is that the design of the Maine was pathetic. The boiler rooms were right next to where a lot of the ammunition was, and once one bit of ammunition goes, the rest went, and it blew up the whole ship, blew into pieces. And of course, we said it was a mine or a torpedo. It wasn't anything like that, but it was a good excuse. And we declared war. And there was a few battles. It was a short war. It didn't take long because you had the Spanish that were there. It wasn't large amounts. And also the Cubans fought with us. Now here's the problem. That the Americans had no idea what the Cubans looked like. And when they discovered they were black, they were shocked that they were actually helping. And this is really awful. And this sounds almost like it can't possibly be true. But it was. And we fought against the Spanish, fighting side by the Cubans. There was a lot of racial tension. There was a lot of bad things happening. You know, when the Spanish finally surrendered, we let them keep their guns, but we took the guns from the Cubans after the war because we thought that they were unable to have intellectual thought. We thought they were lowlives because of their ethnicity. This is scary stuff. Another thing that's also rather frightening about the Spanish-American War is the sainthood and the canonization of Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. Well, that's almost dogma in American history. That the Rough Riders charged up San Juan Hill, defeating the Spanish. Excuse me. Well, the story is a little different. First off, the Rough Riders were under Leonard Wood. He was who's in command of them. Theodore Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He resigned his position and wanted to form his cavalry. Well, they got together. He got many cowboys, academics, librarians, violinists. It was a Whitman sampler of individuals. They went to Florida to train, and through some misstep, they left their horses in Florida. And they became known as Wood's Weary Walkers. And I guess you might call the Rough Riders became the Rough Walkers. And then they had the great battle. It was called the Battle of Kettle Hill. It's named such because they found a kettle on top of the hill. I mean, no big deal, but the great battle. And there were something called buffalo soldiers, African American soldiers. And they were sent in to go against the Spanish. There was a group firing Gatling guns at the top of Kettle Hill. And by the time that a lot of the African Americans made it up the hill, followed by Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Walkers, it was pretty much all over. In fact, by the time that the Rough Riders got to the top of the hill, the Spanish were gone. Now, the interesting thing is this, that there were a number of casualties. Roosevelt was on a horse. He was the only one on a horse. Everybody else was walking. Theodore Miller, who was Thomas Edison's brother-in-law, was in that battle, and he was killed. He was a violinist. In fact, the individual I studied with to study Thomas Edison, and I spoke to a number of times, was Theodore Miller Edison, was Edison's youngest son, named in honor of Theodore Miller. He was born just a few days after the battle, hence his name. But the thing is that William Randolph Hearst had a very strong control of Theodore Roosevelt. He was a kingmaker. And Theodore Roosevelt had great and strong political aspirations. And William Randolph Hearst said, that's no name for a battle. And so he changed it to the Battle of San Juan Hill. Now, the Battle of San Juan Hill was not fought by the Rough Riders or Theodore Roosevelt. Theirs was the Battle of Kettle Hill, and it was not that long a battle. In fact, by the time they got up to the top of the hill, as I mentioned, the Spanish were pretty well gone. And so Theodore Roosevelt said, let's go over to San Juan Hill, and he got like 6 soldiers together. And then he got yelled at, saying, go back and protect the hill. Don't really hear this part of the story, but that was about it. His entire career was made up of that. In many respects, Theodore Roosevelt would base his entire career on the Battle of San Juan Hill. In 2001, he received the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously for his great actions. Sadly, all those around the African American Buffalo troops, the Parker who was shooting the Gatling guns, which made the biggest difference, and many others received no recognition at all. It was almost like Theodore Roosevelt was there by himself. And often when Theodore Roosevelt would describe the battle, it would sound like he was the only one there. Henry Adams used to say, having dinner with Theodore Roosevelt was always a problem because he talked too much. And when he talked, it was only about himself. Gives you an idea what Theodore Roosevelt was like. It's an interesting thing. I mean, we don't hear a lot of this stuff. Granted, the Rough Riders, they fought in the battle. There were casualties. But the story, and Theodore Roosevelt's story, has been greatly exaggerated. And much to the degree due to yellow journalism, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Puzzler. You know, it's fascinating. I mean, if you think about it. I mean, what was that famous line by William Randolph Hearst when he sent his agents down, his reporters? They said, we don't see any trouble. He said, you send me the dispatches, I'll make the war. And he did. And he also made a president. Interesting. Lots of other things took place during this time. Admiral Dewey became very famous, the Battle of Manila Bay. And you know, we adored Dewey for a while. He had 2 commands, which everyone knew. The first, you may fire when ready, Gridley. Gridley was the captain of the Olympia, by the way, which still survives in Philadelphia, by the way. The other line was, pull back for breakfast. And we said he was the greatest leader since Washington. We had Dewey Day in New York City in 1899. Dewey was honored in Washington, D.C., and there was a clamoring for Dewey for president in the year 1900. We built in New York City on 23rd, 24th Street by Madison Square Park, the Dewey Arch. Massive thing. And it was temporary. They were raising money to make the permanent one. And the interesting thing is that everyone said he should run for president. And Dewey looked at the situation, talked to the press, said, I have looked at the office of president, and it's not a difficult job. And he said, I can handle this, and basically, I can deal as president like I do in the Navy, taking orders from Congress. And everybody sat there and said, oh God. And they realized that Dewey wasn't the brightest bulb. And so Dewey went bye-bye. And they tore down the Dewey Arch. And everyone did their best just to kind of forget about Admiral Dewey. And everyone focused on Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt became the governor of New York, eventually became vice president to William McKinley, and unfortunately William McKinley was assassinated. And that is how Theodore Roosevelt became president. There was a lot of stuff going on back then. Not all of it was good. We became an empire. I must say that a lot of great reputations were sullied in the Spanish-American War. And some were, unfortunately, over-exaggerated. And some of the greatest heroes who fought in that war, and some of the greatest atrocities that were conducted in that war were swept under the carpet. And basically today, all we know about the Spanish-American War and the Filipino American War is the Battle of San Juan Hill and the Battle of Manila Bay. And that's kind of a sad thing, because our history is very flawed. And our history of this period of time is frighteningly flawed. Study it. Look at it. And when you look at it, read between the lines. And you'll see things that will truly and totally shock you. Thank you.